Hi, I'm Jane Wakefield, and I host The Human in the Loop in partnership with Gravity. That's Gravity with 2 E's, helping organisations innovate with AI securely. We explore the rise of AI agents, their history, their potential, and the risks organisations must navigate as they scale. Search for Human in the Loop wherever you get your podcasts.
The Presidencies of the United States is a proud member of the Evergreen Podcast Network.
The late war formed an epoch of a peculiar character, highly interesting to the United States. It made trial of the strength and efficiency of our government for such a crisis. It had been said that our union and system of government would not bear such a trial. The result has proven the imputation to be entirely destitute of foundation. The experiment was made under circumstances the most unfavorable to the United States and the most favorable to the very powerful nation with whom we were engaged. The demonstration is satisfactory that our union has gained strength, our troops honor, and the nation character by the contest. James Monroe to the Senate Committee on Military Affairs, 22nd of February, 1815.
James Monroe, like the nation that he served, started down his path in fits and starts. At times, being at a high point as a key leader in the Confederation Congress before seeing his fortunes dip down again to the point he struggled to get elected to the Virginia General Assembly. As we shall see, on his path to the presidency, there would be some more peaks and valleys for him to travail before attaining the highest office in the land. Before we get to that, though, I'd like to welcome you to the Presidencies of the United States. I'm your host, Jerry Landry. Special thanks to Ethan Johnson for providing the intro quote for this episode. Ethan is the host of Play History, a YouTube channel that explores the history of video games, starting with their origins on up to how they are influencing the world of the modern day. As someone who's grown up with video games and seen the evolution from Pong on Atari to MMORPGs, it is a fascinating topic to explore. I'll have a link to Ethan's YouTube channel on the page for this episode on my website, presidenciespodcast.com, and I'll be sharing information about his work on my social media around the release of this episode.
An all-new season of The Secret Lives of Mormon Wives is now streaming on Hulu and Hulu on Disney+.
Mom Talk has just been blowing up.
Whitney and Jen are on Dancing with the Stars.
Taylor is a bachelorette.
Saying that out loud is crazy. Like, that is huge.
But all of the cool opportunities could pull us apart.
It's causing issues in everyone's marriage.
My whole world is falling apart right now. It's chaos.
Watch the Hulu original series, The Secret Lives of Mormon Wives, now streaming on Hulu and Hulu on Disney Plus for bundle subscribers. Terms apply.
Going into the state legislative session beginning December 1787, Monroe had been in support of the proposed U.S. Constitution. While, like a number of folks, he had his concerns, by and large, Monroe agreed that the Union had to be strengthened at the national level. In listening to the debates over the Constitution in Richmond, however, Monroe grew increasingly concerned and opposed to ratification. When elections were called for delegates to a state ratification convention, Monroe was put forward as an anti-federalist delegate in King George County and Spotsylvania County, the latter election of which he won, again, thanks to the support of his prominent friend in the county. Monroe attempted to engage in the medium of the time in putting forward a pamphlet of his thoughts on the Constitution, but, as described by Ammon, not only was the, quote, pamphlet a curious work, more of a record of the debate he waged with himself over the merits of the Constitution than a direct attack on the document. But the printer experienced issues around this time, so in the end, quote, only a few copies were distributed to friends. So what exactly did James Monroe object to in the Constitution? First, he didn't agree with the idea of the Senate, as he felt that was too close to the Confederation Congress in terms of preserving, quote, the principle of state equality. Monroe felt this was one of the failings of the Articles of Confederation and didn't like it being carried forward into this new proposed government, as he felt, quote, state jealousies would paralyze the government. Instead, he felt that there should be direct election of senators and that the number of senators should be apportioned in the same way as the House, by population. He also disagreed with Congress being able, quote, to levy direct taxes, as he felt that was, quote, an interference with purely local matters. In a deviation with most other anti-federalists, Monroe felt that the national government should be in control of the militia system. At least in that point, he agreed with centralization of power. Despite his agreement with most of what was entailed in the Constitution, Monroe was going to the State Ratification Convention in June 1788 and would be able to stand in direct opposition to Madison in that body. As described in a Madison's Pre-Presidency episode, the main anti-federalist speaker at the Virginia Convention was Patrick Henry. But Monroe did come in on 4 occasions to offer up his thoughts and thus was one of the 23 members out of a total of 173 present at the convention to actually participate in the debate. As described by Ammon, quote, his, i.e. Monroe's speeches, were not the slashing attacks Henry delivered, but were restricted to specific points in which he had taken particular interest. Unfortunately, it seems like, since he didn't, quote, supply written versions of his speeches to the reporter covering the convention, quote, Monroe's speeches are badly reported. We do know that one was dismissive of Federalist sense of urgency at ratification, another concerned how the interests of the West may not be met by the proposed constitutional government, the third critiqued the Electoral College, and finally, quote, on the last day of the convention, in a brief speech, Monroe again pleaded for amendments prior to ratification. Though the convention would ultimately vote 89-79 for ratification, the call of Monroe and other anti-federalists was heeded, and, quote, the convention approved 20 amendments and a Bill of Rights to be submitted to Congress for addition to the Constitution. We know that Monroe was chiefly responsible for at least 2 of the proposed amendments, work that he was able to undertake as he was named to a committee appointed to draft the amendments. For better or worse, when the delegates left Richmond, they knew that a new government was going into place, and soon enough, Monroe determined that he wanted to be a part of it. While plans were being made for elections to the new Congress, Monroe had managed to purchase his own home in Charlottesville, along with 800 acres of land on what is now the University of Virginia. This meant that Monroe was close to Madison's home in Orange County, and when, as discussed in Madison's Pre-Presidency episode, Patrick Henry worked in the state legislature to deny Madison his coveted position in the U.S. Senate, he also arranged the congressional districts so that Madison and Monroe would be in the same district. Thus, these two friends were pitted against one another in the first election for the Virginia 5th District, with Madison standing as a Federalist and Monroe as an anti-Federalist. Now, though Henry and his supporters in the General Assembly had done everything they could to stack the 5th District against Madison, as noted by historian Chris DeRose, quote, Madison would be no pushover. Monroe's friends were concerned about the possibility of his loss to the point that they tried to figure out a means that he could stand for election in another district. Meanwhile, his uncle Joseph Jones, despite being an avowed anti-Federalist, tried to persuade his nephew not to run and instead, quote, to focus more on law. When Monroe kept on with his candidacy, Jones, despite having supported James so many other times in the past, stayed out of the race. The cause wasn't completely a lost one for Monroe, as he was, quote, a prominent, popular, and respected Virginia statesman, a lawyer with a successful practice, and a Revolutionary War hero. The two would campaign hard, writing letters to be distributed and crisscrossing the district delivering speeches. In the final weeks, they, quote, toured together, appearing at courthouses and churches, each speaking in turn. If you remember from Madison's Pre-Presidency episode, after one appearance on a particularly chilly day, Madison suffered from frostbite on his nose. Despite their opposition to one another in the election, there was no breach in the friendship between Monroe and Madison at this juncture. Finally, on February 2nd, the votes were cast, and Madison would come out on top by a margin of 330 votes. Given that only 2,280 votes had been cast, this was a decisive victory for Madison. And of the 8 counties represented in the district, they had split them, 4 for Madison, 4 for Monroe. But Madison had been able to rack up larger margins of victory in the counties that he took than Monroe had in his 4. Indeed, Monroe only won Goochland County by 1 vote. With the election over, life went on for Monroe and his family. To get his new farming operation in Albemarle up and running, Monroe had, quote, servants, i.e., enslaved individuals, horses, and other equipment sent to his farm in March, while he and his family made the rounds on the legal circuit that spring to give Elizabeth an opportunity, quote, to see the Albemarle countryside, which she found much to her liking. Unfortunately, his farming operations would not turn out as he had hoped. As noted by Ammon, quote, at the end of the 3rd growing season, after heavy expenditure on improvements, he, Monroe, was bitterly disappointed in the yield of his land. Thus, in order to meet his financial obligations, Monroe focused more for a few years on his efforts at his legal practice, even declining offers to stand for election to political office. Still, his supporters would not let him stay in retirement forever, and in the spring of 1790, without Monroe's knowledge, he missed election to fill a vacancy for the few months remaining in a term in the U.S. Senate by 1 vote. This spurred Jefferson to work with Monroe's other friends to secure his election to a full term that was set to come up that fall. Monroe was at first reluctant, considering, as we've discussed in other episodes, the great personal expense of serving at the federal level. Indeed, as the capital at that point was moving to Philadelphia, James would want to bring Elizabeth to give her an opportunity to go up to New York to visit with her family, which would add further to the expenses he could already expect. Despite the concern over cost, Monroe finally wrote to Jefferson in October that, quote, after the most mature reflection, I have at length yielded to my inclinations to suffer my name to be mentioned for a public appointment. Before long, he was elected to the seat without much opposition. This, of course, would limit the amount of time that he was able to spend at his law practice, and Monroe informed his clients as such, as well as tried to wrap up whatever business he could before making his way to Philadelphia in late November to assume his seat in December 1790. Unfortunately, given the intense secrecy afforded to Senate proceedings at the time, we know little of the details of what Monroe actually did during formal Senate sessions. However, given his experience in the Confederation Congress and his willingness to do committee work, it seems that Monroe quickly rose to prominence. As noted by Ammon, quote, during his first session, he, i.e. Monroe, and 10 other members held nearly all the important committee assignments. Monroe, however, was not a fan of the Senate sessions being closed door, and in late February 1791 put forward a bill to open their proceedings to the public. This measure would be voted down with 9 in favor to 17 against, but Monroe in subsequent sessions would push the issue. Finally, in February 1794, the public would be invited to sit in on Senate proceedings. While some of his colleagues felt that this would hinder, quote, freedom and independence of discussion in the Senate, in his one speech before that body, Monroe asserted the need for all representative bodies to, quote, be subject at all times to public scrutiny. As he said in his concluding remarks, quote, let the jealous, the prying eye of their constituents uphold their proceedings, mark their conduct, and the tone of the body will be changed. As would be the case for the rest of his life, his commitment to public service did not preclude Monroe from working to take care of family business. As the eldest son, James had tried to provide for his siblings, but his brother Joseph proved to be a challenging case. James had arranged for his younger brother to study at the University of Edinburgh, a luxury that he himself had not been able to indulge in. But instead of applying himself to his studies, Joseph had partied in Scotland. When he returned to the States, James arranged for Joseph, quote, a program of law studies. That ended up being a dead end as well. The worst, however, was learning upon his return home to Virginia in the spring of 1791 that his brother, still in his early 20s, had gotten married to someone who was from a family that, while still acceptable, was lower on the social ladder than the Monroes. Monroe still had his mind focused on the politics of the day, however, and he had been coordinating with Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson and Representative James Madison over the past few months about their opposition to Treasury Secretary Alexander Hamilton's economic and fiscal program, which they felt was anti-Republican. Particularly given what was happening in France with the revolution there, in the time before the Reign of Terror, there was optimism about a new way of shaping society, government, and the economy. Monroe wrote a series of essays under the pseudonym Aratus that was published in the National Gazette in 1791, dismissing concerns over the French Revolution. Even at this early stage, Monroe and the political faction that Jefferson and Madison would lead equated those critical of the French Revolution with being monarchist. By the time he returned to the Senate in October 1791, it was established that Monroe was the equivalent of Madison in the House, quote, organizer and leader of the Republican faction. In a sign of just how significant he was viewed, Monroe would be consulted by President Washington about important appointments that would come under congressional review. Despite his growing national prominence, Monroe still had to attend to matters, both political and personal, in Virginia. He tried to maintain an extensive legal practice in the Old Dominion, but Monroe realized in 1792, quote, that in the future he must limit his practice to the county courts, lest his long absences damage the interest of his clients. His plantation in Albemarle County also needed his attention, but instead, he made his way first to Richmond, then to Williamsburg to attend to political business before returning home. In August, he received a summons from Monticello to assemble with Jefferson and Madison to develop a response to the latest attack from Hamilton. Monroe would take the lead, with Madison supplementing his efforts in an essay series which would be published from late September through the rest of the year, entitled Vindication of Mr. Jefferson. Once the series started going into publication, Hamilton would attempt to refute in a series of his own under the pseudonym Catullus. But Monroe called Hamilton out in such a way that it became apparent, quote, that Catullus obviously held a high post in the administration. As factional politics continued to heat up in 1793 with the radicalization of the French Revolution, the execution of the French king, and the arrival of our old friend, French minister to the U.S., Edmond Charles Genet, Monroe sought to gauge public sentiment in Virginia and share information with Jefferson and Madison. However, being out of the nation's capital when the Genet affair happened that summer, something which you can learn more about by listening to the Washington Presidency series, Monroe was caught off guard by the huge swing of anti-French public sentiment that was a result of the matter. Right after Madison arrived at Monroe's home in late August, and the news started to come in from Philadelphia, the two sprung into action, warning supporters in other parts of the nation, including the West, and drafting resolutions and talking points to be distributed to others to try to turn the tide. As they were working, information kept coming in from Jefferson about public opinion turning against Genet, and while Monroe didn't want to completely abandon support for the French minister, they ultimately agreed that the resolutions they drafted had to, quote, disassociate the Republicans from the French minister without directly repudiating him. As noted by Ammon, quote, on the whole, the Republican counteroffensive seems to have neutralized the impact of the Federalist campaign. In the first session of the Third U.S. Congress, which began in December 1793, Monroe again assumed his role as party leader in the Senate and engaged in political back and forths with the Federalists in that body, with only minor successes for either side, as they were rather evenly matched. Sadly, he would be temporarily called away to New York in February 1794 as news arrived of his father-in-law Lawrence Courtwright's impending death. It would fall to Monroe to work to settle Courtwright's financial affairs, which he found, quote, in great confusion, with little prospect of any return from a once substantial estate. Monroe also found himself at odds with Washington in April when, upon hearing rumors that the president intended to nominate Hamilton as a special envoy to Britain to address remaining tensions between the two nations, the senator requested a meeting to discuss his objections. Though Washington had previously consulted with Monroe on appointments, he took offense at Monroe's presumption to ask for an interview to give his unsolicited opinion. Despite the strain in their relationship, the president a few months later would turn to Monroe to fill a vacancy that resulted from the administration's request for Genet's recall as French minister to the U.S. In retaliation, the French government requested the recall of U.S. Minister to France Gouverneur Morris, an unabashed Federalist who had ruffled more than a few feathers in the revolutionary regime. Now, we should note that Monroe was far from Washington's first choice for the post. Indeed, at that point, Robert R. Livingston and James Madison had rejected the offer, and Washington had abandoned an idea to move Thomas Pinckney, current U.S. Minister to Britain, across the Channel after John Jay had refused to take up the post in London. It was widely believed by many that Senator Aaron Burr, Democratic-Republican from New York, would be asked to take up the post, and indeed, Burr was eager for it. Monroe, too, believed the appointment of Burr was coming, up until the point that Secretary of State Edmund Randolph showed up at Monroe's desk in the Senate chamber on May 26, 1794, and offered him the post. Indeed, it had been Randolph who had put Monroe's name forward to Washington when asked for possible candidates, and Randolph requested an answer within the hour. As Monroe could not leave the Senate floor at the moment, he sent a message to Madison on the floor below in Congress Hall and asked him to do a quick canvass of congressional Democratic Republicans to gauge their opinion and then notify Randolph of their decision, to which Monroe would abide. Before long, Madison told the Secretary of State of Monroe's acceptance by proxy, and Monroe was quickly confirmed by the Senate for the new post. It seems to have been Monroe's connections to Jefferson and the Democratic-Republican faction, as well as his fervent pro-French sentiment, that had decided the matter in Washington's mind. At a time that the president was trying to balance out the nation's diplomatic ties with both Britain and France, Washington hoped that sending Monroe would be, quote, unequivocal proof of American friendship. Monroe saw it as his duty to maintain good relations with the French, and, knowing the recent strain in those diplomatic ties, did not tarry in taking up the mission, leaving Philadelphia 10 days after his confirmation. Oddly enough, as this was atypical of the time, especially for such a crucial mission, Monroe was not invited to confer with Washington about his appointed mission prior to his departure. Was Washington still smarting about Monroe's gall at daring to give his unsolicited advice? There's no way for us to know. More importantly than this glaring aberration is that he was not properly briefed either in person or by being privy to the official instructions on John Jay's special diplomatic mission to Britain, which was underway by this point. Thus, when the inevitable questions came from the French government about those negotiations, Monroe could only respond with the limited information and misconceptions he had about the mission, which, as we shall see, was a big problem. Monroe's long-term absence from Virginia would pose problems for not only his financial standing, but would also mean that he wasn't available to motivate his younger brother Joseph to actually move forward with his life. Joseph would stay on Monroe's plantation while his brother was away, and though the plan was for Joseph to begin to practice law in Charlottesville, Joseph would instead just while away his days at his brother's home. Further, though James had left his uncle, Joseph Jones, in charge of his finances while he was in Europe, Uncle Joseph couldn't follow through with his plans to move to James's plantation while he was away, as the younger Joseph objected. Worse, Monroe learned that his brother still had unpaid debts in Scotland from his time there, and he had to scramble to meet those obligations as well as his own personal obligations. Suffice it to say, it was a messy time for Monroe's personal affairs, and there was going to be little he could do from afar to settle them. We discussed Monroe's mission to France in detail in the Washington Presidency series, so we won't go into too much detail here. One thing I would like to note here is that Monroe got an early sign of just how little respect the United States enjoyed abroad, as, despite the fact that he was supposed to be accorded a certain amount of respect as a diplomat, instead, upon their arrival at Le Havre, quote, his trunks were opened and his provisions impounded. As we've already seen in the presidency series to date, and will see when he assumes the presidency, one of Monroe's goals throughout his public career was to ensure that the United States was afforded greater respect by other nations. As noted by Ammon, quote, from a very early date, Monroe envisaged a far more active role for the United States in the world scene as the sole way of safeguarding American interest. In order to achieve this, Monroe put his personal warmth, as we discussed last episode, to his advantage in cultivating allies. Perhaps showing the influence of Washington on the young man, Monroe also understood the importance of symbolism and ceremony in a way that neither Jefferson nor Madison seemed to truly appreciate. Unfortunately, in the case of this initial diplomatic mission to France, the Washington administration did not appreciate Monroe's efforts either, as the president's chief advisors drew ever more towards the Federalist political standpoint. As noted by Ammon, quote, from the outset of his mission, Monroe's standing with the administration was damaged by the late arrival of the account of his reception by the French National Convention. Although he had written promptly, stating the reasons for his actions, the dispatch did not reach Philadelphia until long after later communications, in which he alluded to his reception without explaining his motives. Thus, Washington's chief advisors suspected the worst and worked to influence the president against the young man who had served under him during the Revolution. The transition from the pro-French Randolph to the pro-British Pickering as head of the State Department did not work in Monroe's favor, as, to the end, Monroe felt that he was still guided by Randolph's instructions, which he interpreted as, quote, the tightening of Franco-American relations as the primary objective of his mission, whereas the president wished only to preserve the status quo. To that end, despite the fact that Monroe was charged by his enemies back home as being an extreme partisan, the minister did what he could, quote, to remain completely detached from the factions in the turbulent political arena of revolutionary France. Ammon cites Monroe's, quote, tendency, one not uncommon with Americans, to take a generalized view of events as keeping him from understanding the, quote, personalities or private ambitions motivating key French political actors of the time, which, quote, led him seriously to underestimate the power of rightist elements. The Paris that the Monroes entered at the beginning of his ministry was a far cry from the romanticized City of Lights. Indeed, as noted by Ammon, quote, Paris bore visible scars not only of the austerity of the Jacobin years, but also of the neglect and decay that followed the Revolution. Buildings were everywhere in a dilapidated condition, the streets filthy, the shops empty. The Monroes possessed one of the few carriages to be seen in Paris during the first winter of their residence, which was one of the coldest of the century. Monroe did attempt to do something that would benefit both the United States government and himself by purchasing, quote, an elegant residence known as the Folie de la Bouixière in 1795 for about $15,000 with the intent of, quote, selling it at cost to the United States as a permanent residence for the American ministers. When relations between the U.S. and France soured after Monroe's tenure, he ended up having to sell it for $20,000, which, when factored with the renovations to the home and grounds that he had done, meant that there was little, if any, profit to be had from the purchase. This would not stop Monroe's detractors from accusing him of, quote, speculating in French real estate. Monroe's estate would become a favorite with visitors from America and Britain who were enthusiastic supporters of the French Revolution. Some of his most controversial visitors at this time, however, were Irish revolutionaries who were seeking French support in their fight against the English. Though Monroe didn't actively support their efforts, he did allow his name to be used by the revolutionaries to, quote, open many doors amongst French officials. Monroe's support of Thomas Paine, whose freedom he was able to secure soon after assuming his post, was also criticized by Federalists back home. Though Paine left Monroe's circle in the spring of 1796, when the minister discovered the pamphleteer was preparing an attack on President Washington, Monroe's detractors would use the association to paint Monroe as a dangerous radical. Meanwhile, news of the treaty negotiated by John Jay with Britain, which, though only in minor points violated the U.S. treaty with France, meant that the American government and, by extension, its representative in Paris, were on the outs and in a tough position. Given the impact that the negotiation of this treaty would potentially have on relations with France, it's a gross oversight at the best that the Washington administration did not keep Monroe better informed by directing Jay to keep Monroe abreast of developments in negotiations. Given his previous concerns over Jay's negotiating treaties, as discussed last episode, Monroe sent a private message to Secretary of State Randolph via Madison expressing his concerns over the treaty. Monroe, however, committed a misstep in his dealings with the French government when, after word arrived that the treaty had been concluded and he was pressed on the matter by the French Foreign Ministry, he promised, quote, to communicate the treaty as soon as he received it. Given that the negotiated treaty had not yet been ratified and likely would not be for some time, as it had to be carried back across the Atlantic and then debated by the Senate when it was in session, assuming that Congress was in session when the treaty arrived, it was untoward to share a treaty with another nation who was not party to the treaty prior to it actually being in effect. Monroe, however, was burdened by, quote, the unshakable belief that there should be no secrets between nations sharing the same Republican principles. The French took this to mean that they'd see the treaty sooner rather than later. However, Monroe himself found it hard to learn the details of the treaty. Jay initially offered to send it as a confidential letter in cipher. Unfortunately, Monroe's predecessor in Paris, Gouverneur Morris, had taken the cipher with him when he went back to the U.S. Monroe then sent his secretary to London to get a copy of the treaty. Jay, however, refused to send it, quote, except in the strictest confidence. It would take months before Monroe would start to receive any details about the treaty, and the first information he received came from Representative James Madison back in Philadelphia. When he was finally able to read the actual treaty, Monroe knew that it would damage Franco-American relations, as the French would view it, quote, as a violation of the spirit, if not the letter, of the Treaty of 1778 between the U.S. and France. Monroe did all he could in Paris to avoid a harsh backlash from the French government, but he had little leeway beyond his own quote-unquote powers of persuasion to prevent the French from replacing their minister with a special envoy, which would be a strong indicator of fractured relations. Increasingly, Monroe left information about his efforts to preserve good relations with the French out of his official reports to the administration, as he knew he would get pushback. He justified it in that he felt he was acting in the best interests of the United States. Meanwhile, back in Philadelphia, Edmund Randolph had been replaced at the State Department by Timothy Pickering, and whereas Randolph had been favorable to the French cause, Pickering was a staunch Anglophile who had Monroe in his crosshairs from day one of assuming his new post. While castigating Monroe in official correspondence, Pickering also worked to gather support within the cabinet and from other leading Federalists, including Alexander Hamilton, for Monroe's removal. With their support, Pickering brought the matter to Washington's consideration. The president agreed that there was concern about having someone who was pro-French representing the administration in Paris at the time, but felt that there was little to justify a recall. After dismissing Washington's idea of naming a special envoy to France, Pickering produced a private letter from Monroe that he had somehow gotten his hands on, which, quote, contained an offensively explicit condemnation of Jay's treaty. With that, the president was convinced, and in early July, he ordered Pickering to send word to Monroe of his recall. Though Washington had instructed the secretary to tell Monroe the reasons why he was being recalled, Pickering instead delayed writing the recall notification and, when he did, neglected to include an explanation of the grounds for recall. Returning to the U.S. with what he considered a stain on his reputation, Monroe nearly ended up in a duel with Alexander Hamilton, as discussed in episode 2.6. By late August 1797, the Monroes were back at his new estate in Charlottesville, adjacent to Jefferson's Monticello. James originally referred to this 2,500-acre plantation as the quote-unquote Lower Plantation, but would eventually dub it either Highland or Highlands. He constructed a home on the estate, which they moved into in December 1799, and this would serve as the family's home for the next 20 years, though, as we've discussed in previous series, he would find himself abroad, then in the nation's capital, for a good chunk of those years. By this point, Monroe was described by his biographer Ammon as, quote, deeply in debt, and had been forced to, quote, mortgage his Albemarle lands at unfavorable interest rates. He needed this plantation to be profitable and managed to increase his tobacco crop in his first season by 20,000 pounds, a crop that he immediately sold, quote, for a price lower than he would have received if he had been able to hold it until later in the year. Thus, Monroe turned to trying to sell other property, but nothing was moving at the time. He even had to borrow from Elizabeth's relatives to pay a $350 reimbursement due to the federal government in the reconciling of his accounts from his tenure in France. While, as we've seen, debt issues for people with long tenures of public service at the time was not a situation unique to Monroe, we should note that this would be a persistent issue for him moving forward. Monroe was also very sensitive on the subject of his reputation and was still on the ready to defend himself against any attacks by Federalists on his diplomatic record in France when he was nominated as governor of Virginia in December 1799. Indeed, he had rushed his work on a lengthy 407-page pamphlet in late 1797, which, quote, included every official paper of any consequence except those never disclosed to the president, with the key passages in italics. As noted by Ammon, quote, its bulk and cost, $1.50, inevitably restricted the circle of readers. Monroe was also busy in his first couple of years after returning to the U.S. in coordinating with Jefferson and Madison to respond to Federalist policy and perceived constitutional violations by the Adams administration and its supporters. While the trio were understandably cautious in committing too much to paper for fear of being prosecuted for sedition, given the close proximity of their homes, they were able to converse often and plan to further the Democratic-Republican cause. Ultimately, this would help to propel Monroe forward as the faction's candidate for governor of Virginia in 1799. While Monroe awaited the result at Highland, Madison formally put forward Monroe's name and served as his principal point person on the ground in Virginia. By a party line vote of 116 to 66, Monroe became the 12th governor of Virginia. This put him in a critical place as the 1800 presidential election neared. The governor was responsible for, quote, appointing 3 election commissioners in every county to qualify voters and to determine whether the polls might be kept open an extra day in the event of bad weather. Naturally, Governor Monroe saw it best to appoint loyal Democratic Republicans to these posts. He also used his central position in state politics to distribute materials promoting the Democratic-Republican cause. While it was touch and go for a while, as we saw at the end of the Adams presidency series, Jefferson would ultimately come out on top and become the nation's third president in 1801. With Monroe still occupying the governor's chair in Virginia, his friend and mentor Jefferson wrote to him in 1803, asking him to return to France to join the current U.S. minister, Robert Livingston, in negotiating a deal with the Napoleonic government to acquire the port of New Orleans. However, as all of this and his career after that point have been covered in the Jefferson and Madison presidency episodes, I'll refer you to both of those series for more details, as Monroe plays integral roles in both presidencies. There are a couple of points here that I want to note before we wrap up this episode, as they are important to understand leading into Monroe's presidency. First, Monroe's moves to serve as a U.S. Senator, then U.S. Minister to France, then Governor of Virginia, then back to France before serving as U.S. Minister to Britain, then another tenure as Governor, then as Secretary of State, and his joint tenure as Secretary of War, all of that cost Monroe big. His purchase of the Folie de la Bouillaxière during his first tenure as U.S. Minister to France was accomplished through a personal loan that Monroe took out against his land in Kentucky. That was bad enough. But then, factoring in the funds for the renovations that he and Elizabeth undertook, as well as the lavish entertaining they did, despite the small level of compensation provided by the U.S. government, meant that they went heavily into debt. Upon his arrival back, he even had to borrow $300 from James Madison to cover shipping costs for some of the furniture they had purchased in France. When he became governor the first time, Monroe's salary was only $3,333 a year, and the use of a house which, according to Ammon, quote, was too dilapidated to be inhabitable at the time of Monroe's election. Considering that he had to pay for supporting an additional household and entertaining in Richmond at a time that he was taken away from managing his personal business affairs, naturally, this would set Monroe back financially as well. For his return trip to France, knowing that his salary would not be enough to cover expenses, Monroe had to take out, quote, numerous advances from friends. He struggled to sell his properties in Kentucky and Charlottesville. We'll want to remain aware of his financial strains as we move along through his presidency. Likewise, we'll want to stay aware of how his family impacted his political career and his presidency. We'll talk more about his immediate family in the episode on the Monroe women, but there are a couple of points in his pre-presidency career that we must look at. First was the death of his son, James Spence Monroe. The young James was born to the Monroes in May 1799, a few months prior to his father becoming governor. Unfortunately, the child contracted whooping cough the next year, and while Monroe was dealing with the aftermath of Gabriel's Rebellion, as discussed in the Adams presidency series, his son took a turn for the worst, passing away the evening of September 28, 1800, just a year and a half after his birth. The death in 1805 of Monroe's uncle, Joseph Jones, who had acted as a surrogate father for him for many years, was a big loss. Not only did he lose someone close who had been a major influence on him, losing Jones also meant that he lost someone that he could trust implicitly to help manage his affairs back in Virginia while he was abroad. And as we shall see, this would lead to even more financial trouble for Monroe down the line. Around the time of his uncle's death in 1805, Monroe was already in debt for at least $10,000. However, it would not be all loss for the Monroes in these years, as James and Elizabeth welcomed their youngest child, a daughter named Maria Hester, in 1802. In 1808, after the family's return from Europe, their oldest daughter, Eliza, wed George Hay, who had been the U.S. District Attorney who had prosecuted Aaron Burr in his treason trial in Richmond, as discussed in the Jefferson series, as well as in Burr's vice presidency's episode. In addition to expanding the family with the birth of James and Elizabeth's first grandchild, Hortensia Hay, in 1809, George Hay became a close advisor to Monroe from this point forward. Meanwhile, James was still dealing with his ne'er-do-well brother, Joseph Jones Monroe. James had spent over £1,600 from 1798 through 1812 trying to pay Joseph's debts, and it seems that Joseph was hardly grateful for the assistance as he tried to run the show at Monroe's Highland estate in Charlottesville while his brother was away serving as Secretary of State, to the annoyance of Eliza, who felt herself much more capable than her troublesome uncle of ensuring her parents' best interests were handled at the estate in their absence. Though this caused tensions between the two brothers, with James even refusing to take in Joseph's children after his wife's passing, though he would pay for their support and well-being, they ultimately reconciled to the point that Joseph wanted to go on the attack against Jefferson's nephew, Peter Carr, when it was discovered he was agitating against Monroe in the lead-up to the 1816 presidential election. James managed to convince Joseph that would hurt him more than help, and offered to find him a minor government post to help him get back on his feet financially. While this ultimately wouldn't play out, when Monroe won the election, he invited Joseph to come with him to Washington to serve as his private secretary, to which he agreed. One has to wonder if Monroe thought it better to keep Joseph close in order to prevent him from getting into trouble. But that's just my 2 cents on it, as I haven't seen this in any of the scholarship I've engaged with to date. Speaking of going to Washington, this seems as good of a time as any to wrap up this episode. Next time, we'll explore the inauguration and early days of the Monroe presidency. While Madison hadn't left his successor with quite the mess that Jefferson had left for him in 1809, there were still some challenges to be faced, and Monroe would have to decide who he would bring into the administration to help him navigate his first term. Before we part ways, though, I'd like to thank Ethan Johnson of the Play History YouTube channel for providing the intro quote for this episode. Be sure to check out Play History once you're done with this episode to learn more from Ethan about the history of video games. Sources used for this episode, as well as past episodes of the podcast, links to more on all the American presidents, and information on how you, yes, you, dear listener, can help to support the Presidency's podcast can be found at the website, presidenciespodcast.com. Special thanks to all of our patrons, whose monthly contributions help to ensure that I have the equipment and resources needed to continue this deep dive into presidential history. If you'd like to join our patrons and get access to the ad-free feed, which includes patron-exclusive episodes, just go to patreon.com/presidencies to sign up. If you're not able to commit to a monthly donation, there are other ways you can support the podcast. I have a research wish list available at tinyurl.com/presidenciespodcast with books identified that will help to prepare for upcoming episodes. You can also leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Podchaser, or anywhere else with that capability. I cannot thank all of you who have fulfilled book requests as well as shared with folks why they too should be listening to the Presidency's podcast. As always, please feel free to reach out with any questions or comments via email at presidenciespodcast@gmail.com. You can also connect with me on social media if you haven't already. I'm available on Facebook, Blue Sky, and Mastodon as Presidencies, on the formerly known as Twitter at Presidencies89, and on Instagram and Threads as Presidencies Podcast. Last, but certainly not least, I thank you so much for listening. Until next time, stay safe and healthy, be kind to one another, and take care, dear friends.
Rinse knows that greatness takes time, but so does laundry. So Rinse will take your laundry and hand deliver it to your door expertly cleaned. And you can take the time pursuing your passions. Time once spent sorting and waiting, folding and queuing, now spent challenging and innovating and pushing your way to greatness. So pick up the Irish flute or those calligraphy pens or that daunting beef Wellington recipe card and leave the laundry to us. Rinse. It's time to be great.
Stitch Fix. Shopping is hard. Let's talk about it.
I don't have time to shop, so I buy all my clothes where I buy my seafood.
I just want someone to tell me what shirt goes with what pants.
I just want jeans that fit.
Stitch Fix makes shopping easy. Just show your size, style, and budget, and your stylist sends personalized looks right to your door. No subscription required, plus free shipping and returns.
Man, that was easy. I look good.
Stitch Fix, online personal styling for everyone. Take your style quiz today at stitchfix.com.